Yeah, well, I tell you what, I want to make a couple of comments. I started to write about it and got writer's block, but I wanted to say a couple of things, just about a couple of points about the debate last night. It was sort of nauseating for me to, both of these characters are absolutely rotten. There's not an accident that most Americans would prefer some person other than these two, one of these two. But it was nauseating for me to listen to Hillary Clinton talk about Syria. She talked about when they've taken care of Mosul, and it's a tough fight and all of this. All these politicians talk about what a tough fight it is, but it's always working class people that do that sort of fighting, whether it's on the other side or whether it's our own youth. And then she talked about taking care of Mosul and then heading on into Rafah and Syria, moving into Syria to take care of the situation there. And she was asked about the no-fly zone. And she talked about the no-fly zone, and she said the motivation, she said, was she wanted to create safe zones for the people of Syria. All of the millions that are dislocated, the terrible things that are happening, she wants to do it. She's not going to, she said something similar about immigration. I don't slam the door on women and children. You know, I have not yet heard her condemn her buddy Madeleine Albright's comments when she was asked about the 500,000 Iraqis that died through the US imposed sanctions. Madeleine Albright told, I think it was ABC News then at the time, when she was asked about those deaths. They were mostly women and children. And she said it was worth it. This is how Madeleine Albright described it. And I haven't heard Hillary Clinton condemn that. Or, of course, the thousands upon thousands of young children that were born deformed and have been deformed in Iraq due to the use of depleted uranium. White phosphorus, Fallujah is it's like a modern day Chernobyl or whatever what that plant's name was in Eastern Europe. So she was talking in the debate about how she said, I just can't, the image of that 11-year-old child sitting in the ambulance with his blood running down his face, she said, it was haunting. And but the thing is that the policy in the U.S. policy in Syria has been widely known since as recently as 2006. And if you read Robert Neyman's section of the WikiLeaks files, which is Assange's book, where numerous people write about different parts of the world based on the actual diplomatic cables, the US cables that were sent back and forth and whatsoever, that in 2006, the charge d'affaires of the US charge d'affaires at the US embassy in Syria, his name was his name was Roebuck. That was his name. William Roebuck. He sent a cable back home where he advocated that the US, the policy of the US, you see, the US wanted reforms in Syria, much like it wanted reforms in Iraq. And it wanted economic reforms, particularly in these countries, because they were Ba'athist countries. Ba'athism is an Arab, has its origins in an Arab nationalist secular movement. When I was in Iraq in 71, it was the most secular of all the Arab countries. But most of the dominant sectors of the economy had socialistic elements to it. And most of the economy was publicly owned in Iraq and similar in Syria. Also, there was a huge middle class that was maintained basically through public employment. In these countries, and even in our own today, the private sector cannot produce decent jobs for most people. Only the public sector can do that. That's what gave me a decent living. And so the US wanted to, and it did it in Iraq, it wanted to invaded those countries because it wanted to open up their markets partially, the question of oil in Iraq and everything else, to to open up their markets to private capital. The US doesn't mind dictators, but not dictators that that block the movement of private capital, and in particular open up their markets to US capitalism. Saudi Arabia, they're one of the most despotic regimes there is, and of course they're fine. We sell them the weapons they're using now to bomb Yemen. So Roebuck sent a cable back home here in 2006, urging the US to support their Saudi and Egyptian friends, and this was before the Arab Spring. So Mubarak, who Hillary Clinton once described as family, was still in power, a brutal dictator. The US ambassador suggested that they could fan the flames of Shia and Sunni tensions in Syria, and that it would be very useful to them to destabilize the government of Assad. Now, Assad is a dictator, we know, but as the point is, the US has no problem supporting dictators. So way back, this is 10 years ago, and the US, the policy of the US was to do this. Now, as Neyman points out in his section of the book, there is no way any U.S. government official, or it wasn't known among U.S. government officials, the dangers of feeding and fanning those flames of sectarianism in Iraq, in Syria, because there was a raging war in a Shiite Sunni war, a sectarian war that the U.S. was trying to contain in Iraq, and that was unable to contain it, and that conflict led to Rumsfeld's downfall. So the US knew the dangers of creating, fanning the tensions of religious sectarianism in Syria. And still they went ahead with it. And of course, yes, it would destabilize Assad, but they also must have understood what a horrible and humanitarian crisis it would lead to in Syria itself. And that's exactly what's happened today. This crisis, to watch Clinton talk about the tragedy of Syria, or any of them, the British Blairites, the US government, to talk about children and they care and the tragedy of children, it's just nauseating to hear it. They care about profits. She will be the most ruthless individual when she's in power, as she's shown she's quite capable of it. The other fella is a lunatic, bizarre section, a maverick, if you like, of the capitalist class. It was interesting that last night he really crossed the Rubicon, and we'll have the blog will have a piece out, a statement on that tonight or tomorrow. But he crossed the Rubicon when he criticised. What he criticised was really bourgeois democracy, saying he wasn't going to say whether he'd accept the result if he lost, and what that is undermining the way the American capitalist class governs. This facade of democracy, we call it bourgeois democracy, where every 4 years we get to elect one of the candidates of Wall Street, one of the candidates of the capitalist class, and then one passes on the baton to the other gracefully, and the class that's in power and that controls everything doesn't change. Just one section of them hands it over to another section of them. They'll have their squabbles. The same people govern society as before. And Trump attacking that is very, very dangerous, because it opens up it's a hint that they might he might resort to more militaristic, military dictatorship type governance. That we see in former colonial countries and the imperialized countries, where the constant resistance to capitalist domination occurs, and they are forced to rule through proxy dictators like the Saudis or Hussein or some other force, and they can't rule in the same bourgeois democratic way. So it, as I say, to me it was just nauseating. The other point of it is that when you think of these regimes, these Ba'athist regimes, before the US went into Iraq, It was the most secular. When I was there 40 years ago or whatever, I went from Istanbul to Baghdad by train, from Baghdad to Basra by bus. Nobody threatened me. They were Muslims then, they're Muslims now. Obviously, it's not the religion, something else has occurred. And you can keep talking about and saying that, well, these terrorists have the perception, especially some of the homegrown ones or some of those outside of a country that the US and its so-called allies are bombing, that they have the perception that it's a war against Islam. Well, why would you not have a perception that there's a war against Islam? It's primarily Muslim countries that are being bombed, and also the Muslims who are now being portrayed as the world's worst terrorists. It were Irish Catholics for a period when I was growing up. They were the terrorists of the world, certainly in the British sphere. And so what when you think about it, when you talk about the rise of ISIS, what happened to that huge layer, that middle class layer, that public sector, that a layer of people in Iraq, for example, that was employed in the public sector, that had decent livings, that had education, that were doctors, there were lawyers, there were public servants. Where have they gone? The US went in, wiped that out, destroyed the country and its political stability, and a lot of that layer is now in ISIS, is part of what ISIS is. And as Robert Fisk, who's written a lot about the Middle East, a lot of it's good stuff about the Middle East, describes in his article on the situation there with the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1906, when the British and the French divvied up, after the Ottoman Empire, divvied up the region, and forced upon this whole section of the world that was tribal in nature, these artificial nation states. So if you look at North Africa, they're all fairly rectangular and drawn in these very rectangular ways because they were imposed from without. They've tried our democracies. They've been occupied, slaughtered, invaded by imperialist countries. They've tried the system of governance that has been imposed on them, and it's not worked for them. And this is what we're seeing in that part of the world. And Hillary Clinton, who will likely be the next president of the United States, will be continuing that process. So anyway, this is Richard Miller with the Facts for Working People. I just wanted to say a few words about that situation.